Hey, this week we're going to spend another week on arrays before we go into the advanced section, just to make sure we have this down pat. Now, there's going to be a new loop this week, but it's still a for loop. It's called the enhanced for loop. It is a specialized for loop that only works with arrays. Now, you can still use the traditional for loop, and you probably did lots last week. But let me show you this one. It allows you to cycle through an array without specifying starting and ending points. Remember last week you probably used length a lot to identify the length of your array. This is a little bit easier to do. So let's look at this. You could say for loop. This is your starting value. The value would represent the very first value in your array. So whatever is in the 0 location. And because that's an integer, it's val. And this would be the name of the array. So you would put a colon in between. And basically all this for loop would do is print out every value that this array ever has. So even if it had 1,000,000 numbers or 10 numbers, this loop would just quickly go through without saying start with 0, keep going to the end of the length of the array. So let me show you it in another way. Let's say we're talking doubles now, or what's in the array. So instead, you can use this syntax, the variable and the collection or the array name. So we could say for double element. This is the variable that contains the actual element, not an index. Okay, catch that, the value in the item. And values, let's say, would be the array name. If you did this loop, it would add up every element in the array. So if the numbers were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it would add 1, then it would add 2, then add 3. It would keep running a total sum here. So that could work with doubles. And let me show you it in another way. So let's say I have this array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's in the num array, it's integers. And I have this total I'm going to be accumulating. So I could just do, let's go from every value in the array, and the num is the array. So remember, this is the elements in the array, not the index of the array. So this would add them all up and print a running total as we go through. So maybe as you do some of the coding this week, you could use this shortened way of doing things. Next, let's take it up a level and talk about using an array to assign objects. So we already know how to use arrays that hold primitive data types, like int, double, char. But you can also declare arrays with elements that are objects, and objects basically can hold any kind of value, including a string. So for an example here, I'm going to show you some code in a second that is going to hold 5 objects. It could hold 10 if we increase it, the array size to 10 or 1,000, it doesn't matter. And we're going to assign it this way in a second. What this says is we're creating a new array called product, and it's going to hold 5 elements. It's the product array, and we're going to make an instance of the array called products. Now, as you remember from previous chapters, when you create a constructor for these objects, or in this case, are going to call the constructor 5 different times, and typically constructors require an int and a double as arguments. So you might construct one array element as follows, just to kind of fill it up to test it out. So what we're saying here is there's this array, the same array called product. We're going to first fill up product sub 0, which is the first element of the array. And it needs an int and a double. So we're going to send down a 0 for the int and 1099 for the w. Now we could have asked the user for this amount, but now let me show you some code here. So first, let me show you the main method, and then we'll go down and look at the constructor. So everyone look at line 5. Again, like we said, we have an array called product. We're going to have it hold 5 elements. That's the size of the array. And we're going to make this to hold objects. And we're going to name the instance of this array products, just like we did way back when. Now, for the loop purposes, we have int x, and we could have put int, by the way, inside of line 7, but that's cool. We could do it either way. So let's look at this loop, and this loop is going to populate the array. So for x is 0, so that's going to be our first element, while x is less than product's length, or less than 5, because there are 5 elements in the array, the length of the array is 5, and each time increment adding 1. So we start with 0. Products sub 0 is going to create a new product, in this case a constructor, and call 0 1099. We're going to go look at that in a second. So what lines 7, 8 are going to do is it's going to run through this loop 5 times, call an array called a constructor down below called product, and assign it to the instance of that array or instance of it 5 different times. So we're going to put 0, 1099, well, 0 and 1099, 1 and 1099, 2 and 1099, 3 and 1099, 4, and so forth, all the way down. And then after we're done, we'll go look at that constructor in a second. In line 9, it's going to now just print out everything that you had. So what it's going to do here is it says system.println. It's going to find what product sub 0 is, go down to the class down below, go and get item num is what we're going to call it. So it's going to come back and bring up the item number. So in other words, it's going to bring back item 0 and then do the instance product sub 0, get the price. Of course, all the prices were $10.99. So let's go down and now kind of look at this class. And if you want to go back in the video to see both of them at the same time, feel free. So don't forget, this class is a constructor. It does not have a main. It is used, the purpose of a constructor, catch this because some of you have had, 1 or 2 of you have had issues with this. A constructor is like separate code. It could be stored on a company's, another app. For example, if you're using PayPal, maybe you're storing at PayPal how much they paid, and that's separate than your own bank account. So think of this class living there. And then here is the method called product, and it's waiting for a num and an integer and a double. We're going to call them num and PR for number and price. We're going to pass down the first time 0 and 1099. So we're going to assign 0 to item num and PR 1099 to the price. So what this is basically going to do, each time we call the first loop right here, it's calling this method down below and populating basically the objects for the instance called products. So this is just holding these values. Think of it as this class is saving the values. And then later, we're going to go back at any point in time and go grab those. We're going to call get item num. Let's go down here and look at that. So get item num is a method that's just returning the item back to you so that it could be printed. And don't forget, we need the instance of that, and we call the method. Instance of it, we call the method. So what I'm really showing here, how often would you really need to do 0 and 1099? But the idea here, when you run it, is this is what it would produce, 0 through 4, 1099 each time. Really, in real life, I doubt you would assign everything 1099, but you might be asking the user, how much did you pay for the first item? How much did you pay for the second item? And passing that down to the class to store that. So this is just a real simple code here that you'll produce something similar that will hold whatever they input into an object into another class. Next, I want to take you into something extremely powerful now in the array space. It's called parallel arrays. Now, first, when we're talking parallel arrays, these are separate arrays that possibly have something in common. Let me give you a great example here. It's called days in the month. Most of you know January has 31 days, February has 29 days, March is 31. You get the idea. So what this is look in line 6. We are declaring an array called months. It's a string array, and it's just holding the 12 abbreviations for the 12 months of the year. So month sub 0 would be January, and month sub 11 would be December. So far, so good. Now, line 8 is a totally separate array. But notice these arrays do have something in common. Let's first look at this array in line 8. We have an integer array named days. Days sub 0 would be 31, and days sub 11 would also be 31, but you see the numbers inside. The reason we call these two arrays parallel is that their subscripts or their indexes are the ones that are the same have coordinating data within them. For example, in sub 0 for months, month sub 0 is January, day sub 0 is 31. These two are parallel in the fact that there are 31 days in January. Month sub 1 is February, and day sub 1 is 29. And of course, they have something in common. So let's establish two separate arrays or more. You could actually have 3 arrays that have something in common. Maybe the third array might be the average temperature in Lynchburg. We could have int temperature. In January, maybe the average temperature is 48 degrees. So that could be in a third array. So when we say parallel, it doesn't always have to be 2. Now, once we have these 2 arrays established, and these could be assigned like these 2 were, or inputted through user input, or we could have done a constructor class, whatever, but they've now been established. Now we're going to ask the user to enter a string called month entered. We're going to ask the user to enter a 3-letter month abbreviation. And we're going to be able to tell the user how many days are in that month. Int x is just going to be for the for loop. So here's a line 11. It's just simply getting it set up for input, as you know. And here is the question, enter a 3-letter month name abbreviation. And here we're finally getting input in, and we're going to assign that to the string called month entered. So after we get that input, let me go ahead and run this program and show you before we go to the final loop. Let's say it comes down, it's doing what we see in line 12 and 13, enter a 3-letter month abbreviation. Well, right now, probably when you're reading this, it's November. So I'm going to put NOV. Got it? Now, when I hit enter in a second, let me show you what the loop is going to do. In line 14, we're going to do a loop that starts out at 0 and keeps going through all the elements of the array, because months.length would actually be 12. The computer can count. We don't have to put the number 12 when we assign literal values. So it's going to basically go from 0 through 11. It stops when it's less than 11. When it gets to 12, it'll end. So let's see what happens the first time. Line 15 says, if months sub 0, now let's stop. That's going to pull up January. If that is equal to what they just typed in, remember we have to use equals because it's a string. You can't use 2 equal signs when you're comparing strings. So if this is true, it's going to say month sub 0, so in other words, January can have day sub 0, 31 days. This is why we call it parallel, because if we find the month that they enter, then whatever that index is, can tell me what month that is and how many days the parallel index has. Now, because November is going to be late in the game, let's face it, it's sub 10. You say why sub 10? Because sub 11 finishes it. So finally, when X is finally 10, it would say if month sub 10 equals November, oh, we finally have a match. And it will then say month sub 10, which is November, can have days sub 10. Let's look up here. Days sub 10 is 30 days. So let's see if it works. So now we run it. I'm going to put NOV for November. November can have 30 days. Let me run it again. Let's go with February when it's really sub 1, the index. And it will show me down here that the parallel, hold on, did we do that right? FEB, there we go. February can have 29 days. You say, well, I thought it was 28. Don't forget, during leap year, it can. So that's why we did put 29 here. So this is really super powerful because now when we have, let's say, a massive array at a local bank, let's call it Wells Fargo Bank, although they've not always done everything up and up if you've seen the news. But anyway, Wells Fargo, let's say they have literally hundreds of thousands of customers. And I call Wells Fargo Bank and I say, my name is Corinne Hoisington. And they would type in Corinne and Hoisington and see what record has both Corinne and Hoisington. Now, I'm hoping there are not more than one Corinne Hoisington or we could run into trouble. But let's say I am customer number 30,876. In other words, that's the index where they found Corinne and Hoisington. It's the only one. So then they confirm my address to make sure it's me. So now they could use that to see the 30,000 number. What's my balance at the bank? All these different things. So what you're looking at here is extremely common in coding. Very, very powerful parallel arrays. One of the last topics in arrays that can be a little challenging but super important is understanding when you pass a single element from an array or all the elements of an array to another method, and that method makes a change to the values in the array. Does the main method know about that? So let's start here. You can pass a single array element to any method. It's kind of the same as passing a variable. I want to say, I don't like how the book does this, so let me just say it. I always teach it by saying arrays are passed by reference. And I do see that they do use the reference on this second slide. What that means is the object holds a memory address. So think of when you assign a value in the memory of a computer, it has an address where that lives. Think of it like a house address. So when you pass the method that's been assigned in main, the values of it down to a receiving method, it gets a copy of the array's actual memory address. So what's really being passed is the copy of that address where the location in memory where the data lives. And that receiving method now has the ability to alter the original value in the array. So it's best to show you so you can see exactly what's happening here. So here's the main method. On the next screen, I will show you the receiving method. By the way, the receiving method is called method gets array. Okay. So first of all, we have a constant right here. We're going to say that there are going to be 4 elements in the array. And here's the actual array. We've assigned just some numbers, 5, 10, 15, 20, to an integer array. As you can see, there's 4 elements to that array. The integer x is going to be used for our loop. And we're going to first ask at start of main. So what we're going to do is just go through a single line inside of a for loop that's just going to print what is in the array right now. So it's going to print the first time around sum num sub 0, which is 5. So it prints out the 5. X becomes 1, sum num sub 1. It now prints 10, it prints 15, it prints 20. It stops when it gets beyond the number of elements. So far, this has produced, no shock, 5, 10, 15, 20. It now prints a blank line. And now we have a method call. And let me show you how to pass an array through a method that, not to a different constructor, but within just another method within the same class. It's called method gets array. And notice the array, by the way, the book made a mistake. That should be a lowercase s, sum nums. Got it? And when an array is passed to a method, no brackets are used. So it kind of looks like any other variable. We call this the argument, if you remember. So here we have the calling method. Here's our argument. Let me now go to the next page and we'll come back. So the next page is this other method. It's in the same class. It's called methods get array. And this is the receiving method. And what we've passed it is called a parameter, if you remember. So we had an argument, then a parameter. So now that I'm passing this integer array, we're renaming it called ARR as its name. But notice brackets are used in the parameter list to show that an array was passed. So you don't need to put brackets on the argument, but you do put brackets on the parameter when it's received. So the array sum nums is the argument. It's passed over here as a parameter. We use the braces and we call it ARR, I guess, for array. So let's see what this array does. It's going to have an X for a loop. We're going to print at start of method ARR holds. And we're going to do a quick little loop just to show it's still going to print out ARR of 0, which is 5, and then of 1, which is 10, of 2, which is 15, of 4, which is 20. So it's going to print out 5, 10, 15, 20. So nothing's changed yet. It's just proving that it did get passed over. This line is going to print an empty line. And then this loop does something kind of interesting. It's going to write on top of the variables that were passed over. Remember, when the variables are passed over, their reference was passed. In other words, their location in memory. So now when we say start this loop at 0, keep going till the end of the array, ARR.length. ARR sub 0, remember 5 was in that. Now we're telling it right on top of it, 888. So you're probably asking, is it going to write on top of the original that was in main? Absolutely. It's going to, because it knows the original reference of that method, when it passes over an array, it goes now to that location in memory and wipes out the 5. Now it's 888. Now X becomes 1. ARR sub 1 was 10, but we're going to wipe it out with 888. In fact, we're going to wipe out every original value and make it 888. Who knows why? And now it's going to print at the end of the method AAR holds. It's going to show you at this point that all 4 array values are 888. So it's going to go ARR sub 0 is 888, 1 is 888, 2 is 88, and 3 is 88. Now after I finish this method, it does an empty line. And let's go back now to where we were. This is the statement right here that passed us over to that method. So we come back. And now it's going to say at end of main. So here's the big question. Is it going to print out 5, 10, 15, 20, or 888 4 times? Well, because it knows the original reference, it changed the original. So now when it prints out sum num sub 0, it does print out 888, and sub 1, 888, sub 2, 888, sub 3, 888. So here's what you need to remember. When you pass an array, it passes the original reference, the address of that cell, and if the second method makes a change to it, the original is changed as well. Okay, one last program to make sure we've got this. So let's say we're in the main method. By the way, there's a second method called give bonus. So we have these original scores. They're assigned in a literal way to an array called scores. They're an integer array. There's no number here because the computer can go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Got it. So technically, it's an array of 6 elements. Got it? X is going to be our count for the loop. We're going to write down before giving each score a bonus. This loop in lines 8 and 9 are simply going to print scores sub 0, which is 76, put a space. Score sub 1, put 82 and a space. So it's going to print out all 6 values in this loop. Got it? We print out in line 10 a nice blank line. And then in line 11, we're calling, this is the calling a method. This is our argument. It's the array called scores. I don't need a square bracket in the argument. Now, it's actually passing it down by reference, which refers to the address of the memory. So if we make any changes down here, it's going to change what's up here as well. So we're going to come down to line 17. Here is the receiving method called give bonus. Notice we're going to rename scores array. We're now going to call it the test scores array. It's interesting though, even though we're calling it the scores array and the test scores array, we're still referring to the exact single location in memory for that array. So even though they have different names, they're still pointing back to the same little square of memory each time. Got it? We have to do integer with the braces to tell it that the parameter has passed an array down. Got it. In this, we're going to call the loop I, just to be different. We do have final int adjustment equals 6. So I guess the teacher in this course has given a little bit of bonus to whatever scores were here. Let's say that's what these scores are for a test. So now we're going to start at 0. We're going to keep going to the end of the loop, adding one at a time. We're going to do an increment of 6. Remember the plus equals 6? So it's going to add plus equals 6, the adjustment, which is the constant here, is going to be added to test scores sub 0. Test scores sub 0 are pointing back to this original location of 76. I know we called it scores here and call it test scores down here, but it's still pointing to the same address. Think about pointing to the address of the exact same house. Okay, so we're changing that house. So now 76 plus 6 is 82. So in this single area called either scores or test scores, the value in there is now 82. We come back up and now I is 1. We've added 6 on, so now it's 88. We add 6 on to 90, 96. We add 6 on to 75, 81. 6 on to 92, 98. And 6 on to 88 is up to 94. So that's now the array. It finishes, comes back up here. 11 called it, so we go to line 12. Now we're going to print after giving each score a bonus. In lines 13 and 14, we're now going to print out what's in scores. Score sub 0 is no longer 76. Because this loop changed it, it's now 82 will print out. Well, let's run it so you can see what prints out here. So when we run, here is what the scores were before we gave the bonus, and here's what the scores were after we gave the bonus. Interesting point though, we ended up printing both in main. So it really changed the original values. Excuse me. Well, have a great week. Happy November. And start really digging into this early because arrays can be a little challenging. Next week, we're going to do advanced arrays. So I really want to make sure you get these before we move on to a little more advanced.